Alrighty. Well, welcome. I'll go ahead and apologize for any internet issues. There might be a little bit of lag. So just bear with us there. If need be, then we'll do a re-recording. But we've been having issues with Canvas as well. I don't know if y'all are able to access it, but we cannot access it at all over here. So again, just bear with us. We'll adjust due dates on the quizzes and stuff as a result. But let's go ahead and get into chapter 3. All right. So we're talking about growing plants for human use here. And again, the whole issue with plants as we're growing them for consumption, whether it's for us or for animals, they have to have an optimal growing environment. And the biggest thing here is that they have to be able to go through as much photosynthesis as possible. Photosynthesis only occurs for these autotrophic organisms. Plants mostly, algae, stuff like that. Some blue-green algae and cyanobacteria have the ability to photosynthesize, but they are autotrophs, meaning that they are able to create their food from the sun as long as they have the proper moisture in the soil, nutrients, etc. Everything else above that, as we were talking about in the ecology aspect last week, is heterotrophs. So notice that troph at the end. We're referring there to the ecological trophic level, the feeding level. So we talk about the food chain. Autotrophs are the base, the primary producers. We go up a step, we get into the heterotrophs, things that feed on the autotrophs. So just want to posit that question there. Are we the top of the food chain? For all intents and purposes, perhaps, but depends on, I mean, really it's more like a web, right? So there's a loop there, and fungi actually will decompose us someday, unless we're embalmed and in a casket. But nonetheless, eventually we return to the soil in some ways. So in terms of nutrition, only a small percentage of all the plant species in existence actually feed the world's people. One of the biggest and most economically important crops are the cereal crops or the grains, wheat, maize, or corn, rice, barley, oats, sorghum, rye, millet, etc. Over half of our world's food supply come from these crops. The next most economically and nutritionally important group of crops are the roots and tubers. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassavas, and cassavas are a tropical root crop. Oil crops, anything that we derive some sort of edible oil from, whether it's soybean oil, corn, peanuts, palm, coconut, etc. Sugar, which primarily comes from sugar cane in tropical areas, and in temperate areas comes from sugar beets. Now in North America, it's actually switched to sugar beets from sugar cane. Then we have our fruit crops, of course, and fruit crops and the vegetable crops kind of get confusing here. Botanically speaking, tomatoes and melons are actually fruits. But when we talk about nutrition, diet, often we're referring to fruits as more of the sweet fruits like bananas, oranges, apples, and pears, and vegetables as basically anything that's not as sweet. So tomatoes are classified as vegetables, but botanically they're fruits. Botanically, anything that contains seeds and is a result of sexual plant propagation is a fruit. A vegetable is from asexual production. So lettuce, carrots, those are the vegetative parts of the plant. Asparagus, that's the shoot of the plant. So because it's a vegetative product, it's a vegetable. But those two terms often are kind of used interchangeably, whether we're looking at nutrition or botany. Nonetheless, those are actually the greatest plants and that we obtain our calories from. And today we actually eat plants from less plant families. Altogether, we were looking at about 25 different plant families than we did when we were hunters and gatherers. When we were hunters and gatherers, they say, more like, not a ton more, but more along 40 or 50 different families of plants. A little bit more diverse source of nutrients in our diet. So this table here is just showing the common crops that are ranked in relation to the calories and proteins produced per the unit of land area. So notice that in terms of calories produced, we have things that have a lot of carbohydrates in them. So things like sugarcane, potatoes, sugar beets, corn, rice. In terms of protein, though, we have more legumes like soybeans and peanuts. Notably, potato and corn are still high on both fronts there, which makes the potato and corn both very important agricultural crops because in terms of land area, they produce a lot of calories and a lot of protein. Unfortunately, all that photosynthesis, all the growing of plants, doesn't necessarily go into the part of the plant that is available for human consumption. So we think of the most nutritionally dense parts of plants as the seeds themselves and also the roots. It's where the plants tend to concentrate most of the energy. And we get that peak nutritional benefit right after harvest. So as we transport and market some of these crops, we actually lose some of that energy. In terms of nutrition, an adult human being needs 2,000 to 3,000 calories of energy every day. Of course, that does depend on your size and your level of activity, what you're doing. I really like to backpack. I like to go hiking and backpacking. And we say at that level of activity, we're talking about, 5,000 to 6,000 calories. If you're, not really doing much, having a very, let's just say a lazy day, sitting at home on the couch watching TV, you probably only need about 1,000 calories. But on average, the average human being needs 2,000 to 3,000 calories. And lots of different places that we could get them, and it's important to have a diversity in our diet. If we were just looking at just getting it from one source, they say that 24 to 36 slices of bread would get our 2,000 to 3,000 calories of energy per day. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could eat that much bread. I think you'd have some probably negative side effects with that as well. So where else do we get it? So carbohydrates, of course, the breads, the grains, pasta, stuff like that. Oil is also a big form. So we say oils, but that could be in any type of fat, whether it's animal fat or vegetable fat. These are lipids, and they are a much more condensed form of energy, so we don't need as much. So they say 9 to 14 ounces of vegetable oil to get that energy. There are some issues, of course, with the consumption of carbohydrates and fats and how we get them. For instance, animal fats tend to be saturated fats, which in some cases can be less healthy for us. also on the carbohydrate form, even in plants, a lot of those carbohydrates are actually associated with some indigestible fiber. So we don't actually get some of that energy, and later on it comes out of our digestive system. We also need about 70 grams of protein every day. That's to actually, for our bodies, not just to maintain, but also to grow a little bit too, for our brain cells to divide, for instance. Whether you're actually actively growing or not, we still need that much protein. So where do we get our protein? We get a lot of it from animals, but in the plant world, we get them a partial amount from the cereal grains. The rest of them we get from the pulses or legumes. So those two combined actually give us a complex, full protein, as we'll talk about here in a second. So plant diets may not satisfy our protein requirements if they are deficient in one or more amino acids. So the way it works is basically we consume proteins, and then our body breaks the proteins down into amino acids with which they build the proteins that our bodies need for specific places in our body. So when we look at some of our grains and legumes, or all of them actually, we look at two particular amino acids, methionine and lysine. These two amino acids are used to complement each other. So animals do provide a more complex set of amino acids, so we don't necessarily have to combine them. Our way of actually getting them in the plant world is by combining the grain and legume or pulse mixture. So grains tend to be low in methionine, and the pulses or legumes low in lysine, but they're high in the other. So together they complement each other, giving a balanced level of amino acids, which then gives us the ability to create balanced proteins. So anybody that's a vegetarian, they really have to pay attention to that to really balance their grains and legumes. But of course, there are other things that we need in our diets, other than just carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We also need smaller amounts of vitamins, and these do different things in our bodies, like help cognitive function, help eyesight, etc. Help to form different skin cells, etc. So we get these often more from fresh fruits, vegetables, or grains. Some of the main vitamins that we get from plant forms include vitamin C, of course, vitamin A, which is often derived from carotene or beta carotene. You probably heard that before. Found often in colored vegetables and fruits, things that are yellow, orange, red, as well as the green. There's also vitamin B12, and again, this is a place where vegetarians tend to lack this because it is not provided by plants. So they have to figure out different ways of getting these. So looking at consuming, say, nutritional yeast or fungi or other forms if you're a vegetarian. Of course, vitamin B12 is found in a lot of different meat and dairy products. We also have 6 major inorganic nutrients in addition to, again, the carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and vitamins that we need. And that's calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, potassium, and chloride, as well as 7 other micronutrients. And all of these can be obtained from plant foods, although they're often more found in animal foods, meat and dairy products. So when we take a step back and look at our calorie needs and how we get them, from what sources, and how we get that actually from the land. So in this image here, we're looking at the different types of foods here: fruits and vegetables, legumes, and grains, and how the different, they take up different areas of land. So at a diverse mix, this has mostly wheat here, some legumes, and some fruits and vegetables. We're looking at close to 2/10 of a hectare of land to get, basically the same, amount of calories, 3,000 calories, as a mix of corn, beans, and fruits and vegetables. So just to note, it's different amounts of these necessary nutritional requirements come from different sources, which requires us to use land differently. In the U.S., we have, kind of an industrialized agriculture system where we're using, a lot of synthetic fertilizers and other chemicals to make sure that we get the proper yields. So these figures that we're listing on this chart over here, this graph, are somewhat optimistic because they're based on yields in the U.S. It is questionable whether the inputs used to attain U.S. yields are actually physically available or even environmentally desirable or sustainable on a worldwide scale. So other parts of the world, you have to use different combinations of different foods in order to get those calories and vitamins. Worldwide, if we were to just divide the world's population by the available land, available arable land, and that boils down to about 1/4 of a hectare or a little bit over half an acre of cropland per person, which is enough to actually provide everyone, even with a vegetarian diet. But we have to look at the inputs that we put in. So all of those inputs that we put in to get that energy out, they're not the same worldwide. They differ in place to place. As we have already discussed, crop production has become concentrated and specialized in the particular regions and countries around the world. So for instance, California and Florida together produce more than 60% of the fruits and vegetables grown in the United States. And you probably started to see some of that in the lab that we did. This is causing us to move crops potentially thousands of miles from the producers to consumer. Also, we've gotten to the point where we've tried to kind of narrow our diet into foods, a particular group of foods that may not be available in our country, our part of the world, year-round. So we're importing them. Right now we have plenty of fruits that we're harvesting in the United States, but here in the winter months, we're accustomed to eating those same foods, but we're importing them from the southern hemisphere, so places like South America. So what potential issues arise out of it, and is it sustainable? Just posit that question. What do you guys think? So some argue that from an ecological perspective that we should actually just be consuming local produce. However, if we were eating, just local produce, some of that out of season production has much higher energy costs. The energy or embedded energy in that might not make sense. So is consuming local foods always better for the environment? Maybe, maybe not, right? It just depends on how and where they're produced. So notice here that strawberries that are, transported in from Florida to Ohio, in this case, we're looking at 14 kilojoules per kilogram of energy being input, and then 1,250 coming out of that. So it actually has a relatively low energy cost compared to, in this case, greenhouse produced lettuce, which has, this is probably not the best example because we're putting a lot of energy into heating a greenhouse in the winter, depending on where it is. And we're not getting a lot of food energy out of lettuce. So it's going to be different for every, specific thing that we are looking at. Lettuce, of course, is like 99% water, so there's not, much calories or proteins or carbohydrates in there. It's just mostly water. So that's a lot of energy going in for that really high relative energy costs. So anyway, just examining what do you eat? How is it actually, what is the impact of what you eat on, the planet, the ecology? So nutrients in the produce are also removed from where the crop was grown. So in order for us to actually have sustainable production, we have to balance nutrient flow and really energy flow too. So for instance, what happens on a farm in California where they're producing all of this, these fresh vegetables, and then they're trucking them out. They are exporting nutrients from that farm. They have to do something to get those nutrients back in. They have to import those nutrients back. So in some cases, it actually makes sense to import things from where it is most easily produced. In other cases, it might not make sense. If we were to try to grow bananas, which tend to fruit in late fall, early winter, we would have to have greenhouses to be able to produce them in our area. A lot of energy would be input into that. It wouldn't make sense energy-wise or economically to have local bananas. So that whole local argument is not always correct. We also have to think about how much water is needed to produce crops. For instance, and again, it just depends on where there is natural rainfall, where the crop is produced, but it can take a ton of water to produce 1 kilogram of grain. So that's 2,000 pounds of water going into 2 pounds of grain. It's kind of crazy to think about. In dry areas, we might have to have a very large land surface needed to collect the water to be used for irrigation to grow the crops. And that those water needs in these arid locations can cause political problems where, some people will say, hey, we need this water over here. Well, we need it over here. They're trying to get it from the same source. 2 straws in 1 cup doesn't always work, right? There are also environmental issues with that as well. All right, so each person in an industrialized country takes about 1 hectare of cropland, a little bit more than what we actually have to actually be able to survive. If everyone lived in this industrial economy, agriculture would occupy all of the world's land, just because of that ratio. So this also has to do with the issue that we are taking a fair amount of our grains and legumes and feeding them directly to animals. So only 10% of the energy available in the food crops is actually being recovered in the meat or other animal products. So 90% of that energy is actually lost. Again, this is on average, and this is examining it from kind of like the feedlot perspective, taking a lot of this energy and moving it into one place. They're losing a lot of it. There are many, forms of more sustainable animal production too. So not saying that it's not, no animal production is, energy making sense energy wise. Some of it is, but that's just kind of the average there. And of course, due to our specialization, crops that could be produced on one farm are being fed to animals, hundreds of miles away. And they're not getting, in some cases, if it's not a forage, if you're feeding it from the feedlot, you're exporting those nutrients in terms of animal feed, but you're getting them back in terms of fertilizers instead of the natural cycle of the animal waste returning some of those nutrients back, which also comes as an issue in terms of the disposal of those animal wastes in the feedlots, where we concentrate a lot of this stuff. That's where it can also become damaging to ecosystems. Looking at forage, fiber, and fuel, when animals are fed forage and allowed to graze pasture, that energy recovery, they say in the book, can be as high as 50%, but there are some cases where they've run the numbers and it could actually be as high as like 90% of that from crops grown for human consumption. So where this really comes into play is where we have land that is unsuitable for crops but can still provide grazing for animals. It makes a lot more sense to use that land to graze instead of, try to grow corn, let's say. So it should be possible to provide a varied diet for the world's population, as long as we reserve the best land for the production of crops for human consumption, and then confine animals to grazing on the marginal land or limit their consumption to crop wastes. That's kind of looking at the sustainable picture of it. Of course, grazing also has to be managed, as we all know, so that it does not degrade soils or the vegetation that supports it. So in principle, we look at pastures supporting higher levels of biodiversity than the fields from which crops are harvested. So in some cases that, grazing is actually more ecologically sound than growing a field of corn. Of course, we're not just getting food from our crops, we're also getting fiber and fuel as well. So clothing and textiles, of course. Structural materials for the buildings of homes. We also get oils, that are used for burning for light or heat. And I'm not talking about, fossil fuel oils there. In some cases, like in the UK for the longest time, they were, burning peat as a way to heat their homes. We developed paper and cardboard, different dyes, perfumes, and of course medicines also coming from agriculture. So today in developed nations, most of these non-food materials have been more or less replaced by synthetic materials. Those are often produced from petrochemicals. So they're usually coming from kind of a byproduct of fossil fuels, like plastic, for instance. In the refining of oil, we get byproducts from which we create plastics. That's changing, though. I think we're seeing more of a resurgence in the use of, fiber crops from plants rather than from fossil fuels. Only about 2.5% of cropland is devoted to fiber crops today in the U.S. and worldwide. So natural fibers like cotton, for instance, is kind of been on the decline, and it's forecast that it will continue to decline in the near future. However, there have been some crops that have increased in interest, such as hemp. The cannabis plant has a lot of growth potential due to the high demand for its fiber for clothing and other uses. And one of the reasons that hemp is becoming popular for fiber is because it actually, the deep root system that it has actually helps in reconditioning compacted soil. And actually the plant today, and the book is a little outdated on this, there's more hemp being grown for the medical aspects. And they don't really talk about this as much in the book. Because I think at the time of the publishing of this edition, the 5th edition of the book, we were looking at, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is, illegal in Virginia and, still many other states. That was kind of what was seen as the active ingredient. However, today they're growing hemp much more for the CBD. I'm sure you guys have seen these products out there. They're everywhere now. I mean, they're even selling them in gas stations. And again, for the medical aspect of that crop. So we see shifts in some of these crops. So initially they were thinking as hemp as being a very important fiber plant, but right now it's being grown way more for the medical product, even though there has not actually been any FDA documented uses of CBD yet anyway, because it's not, to this point anyway, recognized completely anyway by the federal government as a medicine. Anyway, that gets into a whole lot of different realms there. Hemp, though, it does have this environmental benefit, can be a good fiber, can also be a good medicine. So we're seeing it having a huge rise in popularity for being grown all around the country. We also have to look at biofuels, as we've discussed, at least touched on. They result from the processing of plants to produce things like biodiesel or ethanol for internal combustion engines. So they use oil from soybeans, sunflowers, and canola as a mix in biodiesel fuel. Or we use starches and sugars from corn, sugarcane, switchgrass. There are some other grasses that they've been experimenting with using as well. Also sorghum. And then they ferment those to produce ethanol, which ends up in our fuel tanks as well. Which, I don't know if you guys pay a whole lot of attention to the whole ethanol issue, but to different levels, different mixes in the fuel. Almost all gas stations have some ethanol in their fuel. Even those that have supposedly 100% ethanol free, they do have some ethanol, just because it's being mixed in with all these different fuel sources. Of course, there are some vehicles that are actually being developed to better use that ethanol as well. However, generally ethanol is not great for your fuel tank, right? That's why we have these ethanol fuel stations, especially if you're using like small engines, like a lawnmower or a weed eater. They say don't use ethanol, or at least very low ethanol mix fuel sources there, because ethanol attracts moisture out of the air and can, basically ruin an engine. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that there. One of the big issues with biofuels, at least currently, one, they are, using food crops to produce them, so that's negatively affecting the food supply in some cases, although they're often paired with the feedlots, as we were discussing last week. The other issue is just that it's not really very fuel efficient, or energy efficient, excuse me, at the moment. We're putting as much energy into the growth of the crop as we're getting out of in the form of ethanol, or in actually many cases less. So they say that to produce the fuels, the actual net gain in fuel energy may be as low as 50%. And it's never gotten higher than like 70%. So we're losing energy there. However, I think it is somewhat sustainable when they pair these with the feedlots, because they're taking that waste product and feeding it to the animals. All right, so when we're talking about, other than our fiber and fuel, where else are we, actually getting, our plant crops into, the industries? So we use tropical oil crops like coconut and oil as the main source of oils that, or palm oil, I should say, used in things like soaps and detergents. When we use our temperate oil crops like canola, which is like a type of mustard, and then soybean, those are used to manufacture lubricants and also some plastics as well. So there are some concerns about the pollution, paired with that, and the petroleum availability that has led to suggestions to return to plants as chemical feedstock to develop these, where in many cases we've synthesized a lot of this stuff. So there, again, there's more of a return going back to using these for detergents, plastics. I'm sure you guys have seen like the corn plastic out there becoming more commonplace. Also pharmaceuticals and some industrial chemicals. We do say that biotechnology, genetically engineering crops, a lot of plant scientists are currently examining using that as a way to increase the production of, say, particular chemicals, or increasing the production of the necessary elements for biofuel. So that's something that we're examining currently. So for instance, the Arabidopsis plant has been, at least experimentally anyway, engineered to produce small amounts of polyhydroxybutyrate, which is used in the production of plastics. So it's just another way of, trying to use or get a plant to produce more of these constituents. All right, last thing that we'll cover here is just about how this has changed, basically. So before the Industrial Revolution, most fuels and raw materials, other than metals, used to manufacture our everyday goods actually came from plants and animals. Those sources after the Industrial Revolution were replaced by fossil fuels, so coal, oil, etc. In 1930, they say that plants supplied about 30% of the raw materials, and today over 80% of the chemicals are derived from fossil fuels and petroleum products. However, again, as we're already seeing, and what we'll continue to see, is that this trend is going to be reversing, with 50% of what they call the chemical feedstock being replaced again by plants by 2050, which will require a massive restructuring of the chemical industry, and potentially negatively a diversion of that land from food production. All right, we just have 1 minute left here, so I just wanted to mention this, and we'll come back to it on Wednesday. But the medicine aspect, traditionally speaking, the greatest majority of our medicines were derived directly from plants until, really the mostly the mid to late 1900s. Today, about 25% of the pharmaceuticals are based on plant products. Again, though, that's shifting. It's becoming greater all the time. There's more of a renewed interest in plant medicine. Either way, I think it's important to examine ethnobotany, which is the study of plant usage by indigenous cultures and basically just cultural uses of plants, because they had this wealth of knowledge of using plants as medicine, and of course that has changed dramatically. All right, so it's 10:20 now. I think we're out of time, so we'll continue on that. Does anybody have any questions, though? All righty. Well, check your email, check your Canvas as soon as you can. As soon as that's back online, we'll put up some updates there and have we can change the due date for the quiz for Chapter 2. We'll be amending some of that. If you hadn't already done so, be sure to do your lab too. All right.
Okay. Am I dialing y'all back? Is Hunter there today?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. See y'all.